The Ottawa Jewish Historical Society is pleased to present Mrs. Betsy Alexander Rigal, who will speak about the life and accomplishments of Sylvia Gelber to this evening, Wednesday, October the 20th.
Our speaker tonight is Betsy Alexander Rigal, daughter of Bernard and Dorothy Alexander. Betsy has previously presented to us a paper on the topic of her grandmother, the renowned Lillian Freeman. Mrs. Rigal is returning tonight to elaborate on the life and accomplishments of her second cousin, the very colorful, dynamic late Sylvia Gelber. Mrs. Rigal is a graduate of McGill in Arts and Columbia University in French Literature, and has worked in a variety of positions in New York, Edinburgh, Edmonton, and Ottawa. In addition to being the mother of four and grandmother of 6, she currently works part-time in property management. Sylvia Gelber, one of the architects of Canada's health insurance program and former director of the Department of Labour Women's Bureau, was also a strong supporter of art and music education. She established many scholarships in those areas. Thanks to the efforts of Ms. Gelber and others, the government introduced equal pay legislation, maternity leave, and pension rights. Human rights and international affairs were her main interest. In the 1970s, she was Canadian representative to the United Nations Conference on the Status of Women. I am pleased to present Betsy Rigal, who will elaborate on the life and accomplishments of Sylvia Gelber.
I think she covered all the topic. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of introducing Sylvia Gelber at a luncheon at the National Arts Centre, where she was being honored by the Canada-Israel Cultural Foundation, the other special guest being Isaac Stern. At that time, I began by asking, what can one say about an old girl, as she referred to herself, who categorically denied that she was a remarkable Canadian? As Dan Bjornson wrote in the Globe and Mail, quote, "She was a pioneer from the same mold as those who settled the Canadian prairies. She was also on the ramparts in the battles for women's rights at a time when no one had much of a roadmap. She was an architect of what became our hospital system. She was exhausting to keep up with." Sylvia always attributed any achievements to a personal curiosity and a strong desire to gain satisfaction from her efforts. It would be impossible to relate every accomplishment and activity in which Sylvia was involved. I will therefore attempt to highlight some of the major achievements and share some of the stories. Before proceeding, I would like to thank Beth Rudman, who interviewed Sylvia for UJA project. Beth spent many hours with Sylvia, and she describes this time as one of the highlights of her life. Her tapes are excellent. I would also like to thank Lawrence and Elaine Brodsky for inviting me here. Sylvia Malka Gelber was born in an area adjacent to what is now the campus of the University of Toronto. She was born at home, as her father was wary of hospital delivery rooms in case there should be a mix-up. Louis Gelber had immigrated to Canada from Austria when he was a teenager. Her mother, Sarah Morris, had been born and brought up in Montreal, the second daughter in a large family of 7 children. Growing up with 4 brothers, each more outspoken than the next, it was natural that Sylvia would tend towards being a tomboy. Her mother insisted that she attend what was then Havergal Ladies' College, in the hope that she would become a well-bred young lady. During her early teens, Sylvia studied Hebrew with her brothers, and more importantly, she was inspired by the tales of early Palestine pioneers whose struggles led to the 1917 Balfour Declaration. At Havergal, she also studied the New Testament, which gave her a greater understanding of other religious communities. Along with her brothers and my father, her first cousin, Sylvia attended Camp Moden in Maine, on a small lake near a town appropriately called Canaan. This camp attracted an unusual circle of Jewish American intellectuals, many of whom were prominent Zionists who became leaders of the Jewish community both in America and in Israel. According to Sylvia, her years at Havergal failed to produce the well-bred young lady her mother hoped for. There was still a chance of achieving this goal at the University of Toronto. To Sylvia, the university offered freedom from discipline. Accordingly, she attended lectures which interested her, but were not necessarily part of the prescribed curriculum for a first-year art student. It is not therefore surprising that at the end of the year she was not permitted to continue, since she had neglected to attend the compulsory lectures. She then cajoled her parents into allowing her to enroll at Columbia University in New York, where she discovered she could register for whatever courses she preferred. At last, she was in an academic environment she really enjoyed. Unfortunately, this state of affairs was to be short-lived, as the year was 1929, and her family could not afford to keep her in New York. She was always amused by the biography compiled by the Writers' Union, which states that she was, quote, partially educated at the Universities of Toronto and Columbia. On her return to Toronto, Sylvia tried journalism and then returned to her first love, the theater. Even after a long and distinguished career, Sylvia in her later years admitted that if she had followed her first dream and had not been in need of a regular paycheck, she would have chosen a career in theater. When, in 1931, she produced the classic Yiddish play, The Dybbuk, in English at the Hart House Theater, the reviews were so enthusiastic that they frightened Louis and Sarah Gelber, who were determined that their much-loved daughter not become a thespian. When she started to sing blues and spirituals on the radio, such was their apprehension that they agreed to allow her to go to Palestine for 1 year. Sylvia was of the opinion that it was her father's hope that she find a nice Jewish boy to marry in the Jewish environment. So she set off for the Middle East with stars in her eyes, idealistic and full of enthusiasm for Zionism. The 1 year stretched out to 15. After a short stint of kibbutz life and an even shorter attempt at working in a tea room, first as a waitress and then as a cashier, the turning point in her life came with an opportune meeting with Henrietta Zold, the founder of American Hadassah, and at that time, director of social welfare of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine. Miss Zold persuaded Sylvia to become a volunteer in this department, thus beginning a lifetime commitment to social causes. After a 2-year course, where she was the first graduate of the Vad Leumi School of Social Work, she assumed the position of honorary probation officer to the Magistrates' Court in Jerusalem. By rights, the government should have appointed her permanent probation officer. However, being a mere woman, she was asked to hand over her work to a, quote, properly gendered relative newcomer to Palestine. Thus the first example of sexist discrimination that was to follow her during her subsequent career. A new challenge was as medical social worker at the Hadassah Hospital. This position lasted until she became restless and accepted a job offered by Richard Graves, labor advisor to the newly established department set up by the British government. His main interest seemed to be the organization of a choir devoted to the singing of English madrigals, a major interest of Sylvia's as well. Her attendance at rehearsals being sporadic, he offered her a position as inspectress, dealing with employment, factory inspection, and industrial relations. Thus her career of some 30-odd years as a public servant was set in motion by Graves' determination to ensure her attendance at choir rehearsals. At that time, she was also singing Negro spirituals on the radio. Ever the crusader in the early 1940s, Sylvia achieved equal pay for women in government jobs in Palestine, even though her job as inspectress was short-lived. It was obvious that she neither had the technical knowledge nor the inclination to advise employers, who never paid attention to a woman, on faulty valves and steam boilers. During these years, Sylvia worked closely with the Haganah. She had an intense dislike of Menachem Begin, who she was convinced spearheaded the attack on the King David Hotel while she was on the premises. Her Haganah activities were unknown to the British government. She identified closely with their policies, which embodied the principle of only retaliating when hit. When these took a more militant stance, she became disillusioned, and after one particular incident in 1947, an incident she never elaborated on, she left behind her life in Palestine and returned to Canada. Her return precipitated a difficult year of adjustment. Without a university degree, and having steadfastly refused to study shorthand and typing to avoid a run-of-the-mill desk job, she was not exactly welcomed into the workforce. After almost a year, she obtained a position, first as technical officer in the Department of Health and Welfare at the yearly salary of $3,000, and subsequently as consultant in the field of health insurance. For the next 16 years, Sylvia worked on and lobbied for important social welfare programs, unique in the Western world. Her main focus was on old age security, CPP, and maternity benefits. Healthcare had previously fallen under the jurisdiction of the provinces, but the funding was inadequate. Her efforts led to the success of the Hospital and Diagnostic Act, ensuring free hospital care throughout the country. During this period, Sylvia described herself as a very low-level civil servant. Of course, she was never the prototype of the civil servant. Known for her trademark red shoes, scarves, handbags, and gloves like yours, she loved her fast sports cars and drove them with total disregard for the laws of physics. Dan Bjornson observed that if she'd been an American, Hollywood would have made a movie of her. During this period, she enjoyed her job, quickly learning the lines between the duties and responsibilities of the civil servant and those of the politician, who was, of course, the boss. In other words, she knew when it was necessary to conform. In 1958, she wrote a verse entitled, "All Hail, Career in the Civil Service." My career with the old Gov of Can should encourage each woman and man. I had some promotions, using no potions, worked right up to where I began. This state of affairs began to change when, in 1968, Sylvia was sent with the Labor Department to Geneva. The International Labor Organization was to initiate the Covenant on Health Insurance. Her efforts led to an offer of the position of Director of the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor. Finally, her own boss, she was responsible for labor planning. Her main focus was devising programs to change social attitudes towards women in the workplace. She lobbied throughout the country, introducing herself as the woman in labor. From 1969 to 1978, she made several presentations as a member of the Canadian delegations to the ILO conferences and then to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. Sylvia could always be counted on to use statistics creatively. She noted that in 1969, women held more than a third of all university graduate degrees in Canada, but only 12.6% of the managerial posts in industry. She was quoted as saying that it would seem that we educated our women only to make use of their high qualifications for clerical jobs, noting that 70% of the latter were held by women. The Montreal Gazette observed that asking Sylvia Gelber anything about the status of working women in Canada would produce an answer with no hemming or hawing. She just gave facts and figures that were accurately stored in a filing cabinet mind and were dispensed in a husky voice with her own brand of humor. During this period, she was a familiar figure in Ottawa power circles. She loved entertaining, but never learned how to cook. In latter days, her freezer was full of coffee Häagen-Dazs and chocolate sauce for the younger generation. Her drink parties of the 50s, 60s, and 70s revolved around the piano, which she played by ear, and where she continued to sing Negro spirituals, as well as belting out George Gershwin songs and other favorites. She was definitely a latter-day Ethel Merman. As her niece Nance Gelber reminisced, she was like my own Auntie May. She couldn't cook, but she made a great drink. Ever present in her red handbag was a baby harmonica, in case the need arose for an impromptu song, especially at a family seder where she featured Had Gadya. In 1972, she lent her considerable support to the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, set up by Lester B. Pearson and chaired by Senator Florence Byrd. Their hard work resulted in the establishment of the Federal Council on the Status of Women and the Human Rights Commission. Finally, equal pay provisions were now incorporated into the Commission and into the statutes of Canada. Another battle was on the subject of maternity leave, which, despite much opposition, especially from the Teachers Association of Toronto, who actually canceled her presentation to them, was finally included in the Unemployment Insurance Act. MPP Evelyn Gigantes has fond memories. Sylvia was, she said, a fantastic feminist leader with a marvelous touch on issues. She never did just the blunt diatribe. She was always well-researched, and she made her points with wit. Retirement should have been in 1975, but, as she said, they kept her on as special advisor to the Deputy Minister of Labor. In 1976 and 1978, she was appointed a member of the Canadian delegation to the United Nations General Assembly. During her long career, Sylvia always attributed her social conscience to her Jewish background. She was certainly not religious and refused membership in a synagogue. She had, however, been deeply committed to a Jewish presence in Palestine and was extremely distressed when war broke out in the late 1940s. She had actually come to be fond of the Palestinian Arabs, their language, history, and culture. She left on the eve of independence, driven to the airport through sporadic gunfire by a sympathetic Christian Arab. Recognition came in the form of 5 honorary degrees from the Universities of Toronto, Guelph, Memorial, Mount St. Vincent, and Trent, where she was proud to be a member of the Board of Governors. In 1975, the government also acknowledged her achievements by creating her an officer of the Order of Canada. She reacted to this special honor by commenting that she felt blessed with this recognition by the people of Canada. Music was always one of the most important interests of her life. Throughout her time in Palestine, Sylvia participated in the musical life of the Yishuv. In addition to singing madrigals with Richard Graves' choir, she held forth at informal gatherings, performing at musical soirees, and joining the Palestine Broadcasting Choir and the Palestine Chamber Opera. For each of the latter, she was delighted to be paid 1/2 a Palestinian pound. During the war years, she entertained the troops, playing and singing in a local canteen. Sylvia's abiding love of music resulted in the establishment of 3 distinguished awards, one of which is at the Toronto Conservatory of Music, where she and her brothers established the Sarah Gelber Prize in memory of their mother. In the late 1980s, through a donation to the Canada-Israel Cultural Foundation, she endowed an annual prize in her name to be awarded to a talented and often needy student from Israel. Her main focus in latter years was the Sylvia Gelber Foundation, established in 1981. The award is administered by the Canada Council and is presented annually to the most talented performer in classical music under the age of 30. This scholarship enables these gifted students to attend the best musical institutions. Currently endowed with $500,000, the foundation is expected to increase by several orders of magnitude under the terms of her will, according to Administrator Tim Plumtree. Many of the recipients have attained national and even international reputations, such as John Camara Parker. To the end, Sylvia kept in touch with them by personal correspondence and by visits. Whenever they were in town, they would call on the old girl, obviously for the Haagen-Dazs. Retirement to Sylvia meant carrying on working, albeit in her home. As she described it, she embarked on a new career, joining the ranks of professional writers. The first several years were devoted to writing her book, No Bomb in Gilead, a personal retrospective of Mandate days in Palestine. In 1991, the book won the J.I. Siegel Award as Outstanding Book of the Year on a Jewish theme. In this book, Sylvia led the reader through many of the tensions and developments as the modern state of Israel was being born. Her next undertaking was the compilation of a family history, which was a daunting task, taking into account that her mother was a sibling to 6 sisters and 1 brother. This endeavor will, however, never reach a publishing house, as it has stirred much controversy concerning her depiction of many family members. I was never able to borrow the loose-leaf book, but was permitted in her presence to read only the chapter on my immediate ancestors, and she minced no words on some of them. Noted journalist Elizabeth Gray remembers Sylvia as an inspirational figure who, she said, always made herself available to people like me who wanted to interview her at the drop of a hat. She was always clear and lucid and gutsy and very funny. She had a great sense of humor and was very feisty. An example of the latter quality was evident in the memorable Tea Party incident at the Rigal Club in 1972. The latter, a bastion of a very old and deep-set prejudice that men were superior to women, did not admit women except by a separate entrance and only to the 2 private dining rooms. On that day, on the sidewalk in front of the Wellington Street Clubhouse, portable tables were set up, topped by imitation linens and plates of thinly cut watercress and cucumber sandwiches, along with jugs of iced tea. Earlier in the day, as Charles Lynch wrote in his book, Up from the Ashes, the Rigal Club Story, the club had been the scene of a luncheon for delegates to a Canada-United States policy conference, and the 2 American female delegates had been refused admission to the premises. The protesters, amid all the media hoopla that placards and cameras could create, were serving the 2 delegates sandwiches and tea while shouting taunts at club members who crossed their picket line. The club was then subjected to a barrage of negative publicity. This caught the disapproving eye of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and of a member of his cabinet, the Honorable Jean Sauvé. The federal government, spurred by the Prime Minister and the expanding number of women senators and MPs, started to take some of its business elsewhere. It was not until 1979 that a general meeting voted to admit women to full membership, but contrary to all expectations, 5 months passed before the name of any woman came forward in nomination. Sylvia, who had obviously been prominent in the Tea Party picket 7 years before, explained why none of the protesting women had applied. It was not that they were seeking admittance, it was the principle of the thing. We were concerned as taxpayers, she said, that the federal government was spending a considerable amount of money for business lunches and meetings at a club where discrimination was practiced. Several months later, Jean Pickett, became the first female member of the club. Sylvia never did join, but in retirement she attended the weekly Wednesday roundtable meetings of past mandarins and political movers and shakers held at the Rigal Club. Included in this group were Mitchell Sharp, Simon Reisman, Jake Warren, and Dave Golden. Dan Bjornson remarked in his Globe and Mail article that Sylvia Gelber lived her whole life on the other side of the speed limit, and it was fun to be with her for even part of the ride. Above all, she had a unique and wonderful sense of humor. She was a fun-loving maverick. Ivan Chorney, her cousin and mine, recalled meeting her for the first time since her return from Palestine. He was 5 at the time, and jealous that his mother's attention had been usurped by a stranger, kicked her in the shins. She kicked him back, not taking a lot of nonsense from even a 5-year-old. Her stories were all told with a sense of fun. She was irreverent. When my brother David was 14 years old, she gifted him with a book entitled Bawdy, B-A-W-D-Y, Songs and Background Ballads. Her 1957 short poem entitled Philosophic Soliloquy illustrates this characteristic. Amongst the intellects you'll find an overemphasis on mind. You'll note from the hoi polloi's dull chatter overemphasis on matter. Too much mind can be quite dreary. Too much matter makes you weary. The happy course is in between pure intellect and the obscene. If a person showed any degree of intelligence, she would seek them out no matter what age or sex. My own children and those of David would insist on visiting her from an early age without a parent in attendance. She was definitely uncritical of the foibles of youth and treated them as clever and interesting human beings. In addition to our children, many others of the younger generation, especially from the Morris clan, visited her when they came to Ottawa. As mentioned previously, she was curious about them and about so much. She once told me that she wanted her gravestone to say, "She died curious." Until her final years, she lived by that code. She attended concerts and plays. She was an inveterate news watcher, interested in global and international events. In addition, she was an avid watcher of sporting events, especially the Grand Slam tennis tournaments, and she would usually pick the winner. In conclusion, I would like to quote the last paragraph of Dan Bjornson's article of December 18, 2003, 9 days after her death. In early December, my wife, Nance Gelber, and I had planned to see the wacky musical, The Producers, when it opened in Toronto. But then Sylvia died. We were to see the show on a Wednesday night. Her funeral would be the next morning. What to do? We went to The Producers anyway. We sensed Sylvia was there, roaring away with the rest of us. On a personal note, I will miss this irreverent, iconoclastic, overachieving, fun-loving, never predictable old girl. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Yeah.
It's not a question. I enjoyed very much your talk. I'm the first time here, and I hope I'll come again. But I have one comment. I'm Israeli born, from a family that came to Israel in 1904. And always in any certificate we have, even if it was under the British rule or the French, it says, my mother came when the French were still here, Palestina, Eretz Israel. Always. In any papers that I have from previous time, it has the Aleph Yud Eretz Israel, the country of Israel. So I appreciate very much this is not to you, to everybody. So whenever you say anything about Israel, before 48, to say Eretz Israel, it's not the state of Israel, but under the British and the French, it still was called the country.
Mhm. Thank you.
It's not to you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Would anybody like to know where no balm in Gilead comes from? I even looked it up on the internet today because I figured somebody would ask. And in Jeremiah, who's called the weeping prophet, chapter 8, verse 22, he writes, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no healing for the wounds of my people?" Gilead was a territory in ancient Israel. Is that it?
Any other questions or comments? Go ahead.
You mentioned that her parents had financial reversals in 1929. What did they do? I know they were in Toronto. What were they doing? What did they do after?
What they were in the what kind of business were they in?
They were in the woolen.
Woolens, yeah. But I mean, they didn't lose everything. They kept on with woolens. They just couldn't obviously afford to have somebody living in New York at that time.
Is there from Gelber brothers?
Yes. That was Louis Gelber and his brother. I've got some support here. One from the Gelbers and one from the other side.
Somebody has to be on the Gelber side.
Any other comments or questions? I'll ask Shirley Berman to come forward. Just right here.
Hi, Shirley.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Betsy, Shire and I, my husband, grew up in Toronto as part of that great Zionist movement that led to the State of Israel. And of course, the Gelber name was something that we all looked up to. I remember Sylvia saying that she was blessed to be a Canadian, to live in Canada. But it's so true that we were blessed to have her as a Canadian because we all benefited so much from the knowledge she gleaned from all the people she met in Israel, from Ida and Adele at the basis of the agricultural, women in the agricultural movement in Israel, from Golda Meir, all the people she worked for, she gleaned, she took from, and she was able to put all those lessons together. And as you presented so well, Betsy, she brought them to us in Canada, and we all, and our children and Canadians will forever benefit from the effect and the laws she was able to put into Canadian law for us. So we are forever thankful, and I'm so glad I'm here tonight because it's so appropriate for her to be remembered and for you to be remembering her as a speaker. Thank you, Betsy. And on behalf of the society, we would like to present you with all this paper. I hope there's something good in here.
Oh, I'm sure there is, and thank you for the red, very appropriate corsage.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That concludes the evening. Refreshments will be served now. However, one statement, have a good winter, and to the snowbirds, enjoy the warm weather. That's it.